it's only through the reaction of another that you see that trust is lost. But if you're not conscious enough to interact when the trust is lost, then basically you begin to be distrusting on a very subtle level, and then you act less trusting in return. And it could very well be something very little, like something that wasn't even meant to create pain. But unfortunately, it did. And the person who had created the pain too never allowed, say, a vulnerable discussion to deal with it. To say, listen, when you said that, it hurt me. So people don't feel that safety. So instead, they protect themselves. And then that's when the loop gets further and further and it reinforces itself.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. As a young child, Andy Chaleff had to become incredibly sensitive to the emotions of others in an attempt to evade the wrath of his disturbed and abusive father. He found solace in the presence of his mother, but when he was 18, she fell victim to a fatal accident at the hands of a drunk driver. He fled the United States, embarking on a decades-long journey that led him through the business world and then into a monk-like existence where he ultimately found his life's purpose, helping people who have experienced trauma to transform through the power of self-love. In this episode, Andy and I discuss his new book, The Connection Playbook, how to create a work environment where authentic relationships can form, breaking cycles of distrust in the workplace, and techniques for turning a negative interaction into a constructive one. We also talk about personifying an employer, finding agency within a system, and the importance of intention in an interaction, as well as other topics. All right, if you follow Work for Humans, be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Without further ado, my conversation with Andy Chaleff. Andy Chaleff, welcome to Work for Humans.
Great to be here.
So I've been reading your book, The Connection Playbook, and I'm very interested in talking to you about connections. And of course, this is a podcast about work, so I want to talk to you about connections and how it relates to work. And I can tell that there's three ways I'm going to want to talk about this. One of them is that a lot of people, when I interview them about what they want from work, they say it's connection. They say that they want to work with people who they feel close to and in good connection with. And so some of that has to do with colleagues, just peers. Some of that has to do with managers and how they relate to managers. But I think there's this other subtle one, and I think it's probably going to dominate the conversation, which is that a lot of people that I speak to personify the company. And they see themselves in a relationship with an entity, which is the sum of that company's actions or that company's words. And so I think we can probably take a look at what you've been doing from all of those angles. And so what do you mean when you say connection in the Connection Playbook?
It's funny, when you ask me that question, I feel like I could cry. I can give you the logical words. It's a state in which I feel congruent with all my actions.
Okay, congruent.
So I'm angry with you, Dart. Why are you being a jerk? I'm feeling there's something here that really is touching me. And I'm saying, Dart, I'm so grateful that I get to spend this 90 minutes with you. There's something that's going on in my life which I'm so confused and scared about that I say, Dart, I just came out with a book yesterday and I'm scratching my head asking myself, what am I going to do with this thing?
It sounds like what you're talking about is being in connection with yourself and being very aware of your own emotional state as it relates to things around you.
Yes. And so I'll give you an example to make it concrete. And by the way, I might cry because that's how the emotions come up, they come up. But my wife's mother, she's very sick and we don't know how long she's going to live. And all of this is happening at the same time as I'm launching this book. And I've put years into this work. In a way, that idea of, oh, I really want this to succeed has made it hard for me to slow down and just be there for my wife. And it hurts to talk about it because that's the pain, is that like staying true to this. Wow, there's something I desire, and then there's something immediately in front of me that is so much more important than any of that. And how do I reconcile that and make connection in myself, allow that both to be true, not to judge it, but just to be with it, and then move from that awareness.
It's interesting because so much of the book is about connection with others, but so much of the way you're talking about it right now is about connection with self or connection with situation. And I know that they're closely related as you speak about them in the book. Before we get too much further into it, I'd like to talk a little bit about how you arrived at this and your personal history that led you to be so focused on connection. And you have a line in the book that I think is a beautiful, beautiful line, that as a little boy, you were forced to turn your entire body into a tuning fork for the emotions of others. How did you arrive at that?
Well, so my father would have been diagnosed with 20 things today that weren't necessarily diagnosed then. So he was certainly would have his rages, he'd go through the bipolar kind of back and forth. So as a kid and as a sensitive kid, I was so fearful of those manic episodes that I really had to tune into very subtle shifts in people's emotional states. So it was a survival tactic at that time. And a lot of people who have gone through that kind of trauma, they tell similar stories. And for my coping mechanism at that point was that I would tell jokes. My mom would call me her little shit stirrer because I was so kind of conscious of what people were really feeling, not expressing, that I then had to reconcile all of this, what felt so obvious to me, but no one was discussing it. And the way that I coped with it was just telling jokes. So that was the development. That's why I sort of keyed in on that.
I've heard that from comedians before, that there would be no comedians without bullies, is something that comedians have said. And when you actually look at a lot of comedians, it started in the household and the need to cope with the challenges of family. And so you became this tuning fork for feelings and emotions and states of mind in others. And you continued that into your current practice and into this book, which is a compendium. It's a stacked list. So it's a list of things that we need to consider if we're going to be in connection. And it starts off with the most foundational things: trust and relationship. Just absolutely the foundations of everything else. And because they are foundational, and because I feel like they're very central to this topic of connection at work, I do want to dwell on those for a little while. So let's talk about the importance of trust in relation to connection.
I work in kind of the most intense environments that one can find themselves in. Going back to the abusive dad, I really learned how to make peace with anger. So I can be in the middle of two people yelling at one another, and I feel the softness behind the pain. I don't judge the anger as a negative emotion. I even see it as quite vulnerable. When I started to write the book, what I realized was that actually, when I look at any situation like that, for instance, I don't even want to take another step until there's trust. Like, I don't want to negotiate what we're going to plan, who's going to take which role, how much you're going to get paid. Like, all of those topics are so uninteresting for me. So what I'll actively do is I'll just say to these two people, you don't trust them. They'll say, no, but I want to talk about another subject. So you don't get to talk about another subject. You have to now say, what is the behavior? Because I don't want them to make it personal. Of course, if you say, what do they do? Well, they're this and they're that. Of course, then it becomes messy and you can't untangle that. But you ask, what is the behavior you're witnessing that makes you unable to trust? And then what happens is that you have to create a lot of safety, obviously. This is not like you go in and you don't do some groundwork ahead of time. And what happens is that in time, and hopefully through that process, one of those two will be vulnerable and say, hey, when you did this, it really hurt. And then the other basically has an opportunity to meet them there. And then you have an opportunity to take what would have been a negative reinforcing loop and maybe twist it into a positive reinforcing loop. But the moment is trust. If there's no trust, then I really don't bother with other stuff.
And you speak in the book about the circular nature of distrust. If I distrust you, you're going to feel it and you're going to distrust me. And you're counseling couples a lot of the time, it sounds like. And so a lot of what you work on first is interrupting the cycle of distrust. You used a word in one of your interviews, which was social ecology. And I'd never heard that word before. What is social ecology?
Basically, that systems are far more complex than we want to give them credit for. It's not a causal relationship. It's A creates B, creates C, creates D, and then we go back and then we see the change to A again. And that just takes a different way of looking at systems.
We're going to hold that idea in mind, I think, throughout the rest of this conversation, because it's central to this idea that between two actors, let's say, there's a feedback loop in terms of that interaction. And that feedback loop can be between the leaders of a company and the workers of a company, or it can be between two people, or it can be even one person to themselves potentially. So how is trust lost? And how much does it take to regain it?
It's a moment that one might not even be aware of that occurred. It's only through the reaction of another that you see that trust is lost. But if you're not conscious enough to interact when the trust is lost, then basically you begin to be distrusting on a very subtle level, and then you act less trusting in return. And these dynamics are created and reinforced over periods. Well, no one will ever know what was that one thing that happened where one person lost trust. And it could very well be something very little, like something that wasn't even meant to create pain. But unfortunately, it did. And the person who had created the pain too never allowed, say, a vulnerable discussion to deal with it, to get closer, to say, listen, when you said that, it hurt me. So people don't feel that safety. So instead, they protect themselves. And then that's when the loop gets further and further and it reinforces itself.
There was a bit of an analogy in there, which is connection is closeness, and the opposite of connection is distance. So one of the writers I have on my shelf here, I'm not going to be able to find it. It's a book called True Professionalism. It says, nobody tells you when they stop trusting you because you can't be trusted to be told that. And so distrust is silent or quiet, subliminal. But is there, even though the original lack of trust, we may not be able to track it down, are there patterns that create distrust?
I could say what it looks like when it manifests itself, meaning there'll be less eye contact. The greeting won't be as warm. There'll be a shortening of the conversation. It will never be moving into a more personal domain. So those are kind of characteristics of a lack of trust. But if those things exist, let's say for a moment, now I say, oh, they don't trust me. Like that would also be making an assumption. They might be going through a really difficult moment in their lives. So what I'll tend to do in my own life is that if I feel, and I mean on a very subtle level, even little things that might happen just once, then I will go to the individual and just say, listen, I just want to check in. How are things? Because when we've talked, I just haven't felt connected like I remember that we would used to. And I don't know, maybe I did something or I don't know, but how is it for you now? And clearly you can see, I don't know really what's going on. So if there's any way you can help me here, it'd be really, really, really great. I'd be grateful for that.
Yeah. It's an interesting question about how one might do that in groups. And the reason I say that is because I'm thinking about whole organizations to some extent. And how does one do sort of a truth and reconciliation that looks just like that in groups?
The word that often will be used in the coaching realm is the space holder, right? Who's holding the container for that group? And it's hard if there's not someone holding the container for the vulnerability, because there'll always be individuals in a group who are triggered, and I say always, let's say more times than not, that are triggered by what one shares. And all of a sudden, one might have taken a vulnerable moment and brought it to the group, and then all of a sudden they got stomped on, the chance they're going to bring forward another is not very likely. So when one is going in the domain of like, okay, how do we bring this as a group, as a way of working, it's a very different task.
It's interesting. Years ago, I was in a group of people. This was at a different company that I'm at now, and layoffs were underway. And we'd been through a series, and one of the people in the room, who was always a truth teller, just always the person to call out the elephant in the room, called out an elephant in the room. And within a week, they were laid off. That may not have been causal, but everybody in the room thought it was causal. And everybody in the room basically said, I'm going to stop talking. I'm going to stop being a truth teller in this room. And so it wasn't something that really happened directly to them, but they saw the behavior outside of them in the group.
In that context, I would say, get the hell out. Because if it's true, right, we're making that assumption again. But if that's the assumption, then in one way, we have to decide the environments that we want to be in. And once they're not serving how we want to be, then we just have to find spaces where that's more possible.
Or potentially, as you point out in the book, work on our assumptions. Maybe the assumption that person was fired because of that reason is wrong.
That would always be the first. But the way that you explained it to me was almost that even possibly bringing it forward would get you fired.
Yeah.
So I was already making an assumption there that, okay, this is really a toxic environment.
How does respect different from trust? What is it, and why is it so foundational?
For those who obviously haven't read the book, the first chapters are on trust and respect, and they're put into an XY axis. And trust being the gentle, what I always call the gentle trait, is the X axis, and the dynamic trait is the Y. So respect is the Y axis.
Why do you call them dynamic and gentle?
I call it because I kind of see it as a paradox. I see them as two elements which might appear to be at sometimes contradictory, but in fact are complementary.
And in your 2x2, since people can't see it because they don't have the book yet, along the trust line, if there's low respect and low trust, then it's aversion is the name of that quadrant. If there's high trust and low respect, then it's dismissive. And if there's low trust and high respect, it's skeptical. And then the top right is when it's high trust and high respect, and it's the basis of a healthy relationship. I found this very, very interesting. And so I do want to talk about what is respect and how can you tell when it's not there?
Yeah, I give a lot of examples in the book so one can understand it. I like to look at it with couples because in a way, one doesn't see how quickly they can be dismissive of another because they think they know them. So someone says, oh, I have an idea. And then the person feels or thinks, you know what? You've had ideas for years now. You never do anything about them. And then whatever they say from that moment forward will have some degree of disrespect in it. Maybe you'll monetize this course. Great. Yeah, I've seen you do that before. And so there's an aspect that creeps into relationships where we think we know someone, that basically we know you and we know what you're going to do. And now we're so dismissive of you that we're not showing any respect for your process.
So let's say you said to me, I'm going to monetize this course. We're in a relationship. I've heard it 1,000,000 times. You're going to monetize this course. And maybe you even put some emotion on it. Like you're fretting about the fact that you haven't monetized the course and you talk about it a lot. And I'm like, I've heard this before. You're fretting. You're making me feel bad because you're fretting, because that emotion's contagious and I need to detach myself from that emotion. And so if I respect you a lot, but I don't trust you because you've been saying this forever, I'm going to be skeptical. And say, no, you're not. Come on, get real. But if I don't trust you, I'm going to not say anything because I'm in the aversion zone.
Yeah.
I can't trust you to be in that conversation with me. I can't be skeptical to you because I don't trust you.
Yeah. And let's get one thing clear. We're not saying, or I'm not saying, or proposing on any level that one gives away the experience that they had with another. That wouldn't be true. That would be like saying, hey, let's just imagine that I haven't lived through 10 courses where this person hasn't done anything at the conclusion. How we interact is what defines that interaction. And that's what I'm focusing on in the book, is how to take it and then shift the interaction at that moment, not pretend you're trusting when you're not trusting or pretend you're respecting when you're not. It's more like, oh, how do I deal with it when I'm there in a way which creates a great, actually a beautiful moment, actually an incredible moment that'll go to waste if I just react to my emotions. The one thing that I want to always show is what's the alternative so that people understand you can be in a really bad situation and then there's an alternative that you didn't think that was possible. And the alternative is for the individual. In this case, let's say it's just the dynamic. I experienced this twice, which is why I use it in the book, is that the man was so frustrated with his wife that he started actually putting her down. And the change that happened was when he was able to go to his discomfort, share the vulnerability, and also allow her to connect, and him saying things like, it really, I'm feeling it's uncomfortable for me because I know we've talked about it and I have never seen it translate into real work. So how do you feel this will be different than the other times?
It almost feels like before that's said, there's a charge on everything. And once it's said, some of the charge is released.
And that's part of the practices. I called it the self-love practice. That was the second book I wrote called The Wounded Healer. That was only about this one single practice. And it's, you have to let go of that charge before you have the interaction. Otherwise, that charge bleeds into everything. And then they react to what you're not saying. They'll hear what you're not saying. So you have to say, I don't respect my wife and it's okay. I don't believe she's going to do anything with this money and it's okay. I allow myself, I actually change it to it's something great.
It's effing great.
And by doing that, what happens is I allow myself to ground all of that energy so it doesn't bleed into this, what could be a beautiful moment with this other person.
Which relates to the next chapter in the book, which is triggers. And something in there that I thought was incredibly wise was the idea that you picked the thing with the greatest charge in you. My parents didn't love me, and that's effing great. Okay, it shouldn't sound as sarcastic as that just sounded. It should sound enthusiastic. It should sound, and that's effing great.
It goes in any direction that you can take it at any moment, and it maybe changes over time. Some days you want to cry when you say it. One days you want to laugh when you say it. It moves as an emotion through you, right?
What is the thing that you ask all couples that you work with to establish as a part of getting to trust? You ask them to admit.
Yeah, that cracks me up, because I get asked a lot and I say no more oftentimes than not, because I have really strict ways in which I want to interact. And if I can't go to the deep, dark, difficult place, I'm like, go to somebody else. There's enough people out there that'll take your money for a while. And what I ask is, listen, are both of you willing to admit that you've been the problem all this time? And you'll just see their faces. It's one of the funnest moments to see the clenched, oh my. Because most, as you're probably aware, most people go to an outside counsel because if he can't hear it from me, maybe he'll be able to hear it from that other person. And then what, in essence, then this counselor in a way can enable behaviors where the individuals are never taking responsibility for their part in a dynamic. And if one party needs to win, both parties lose. Because now I need you, Dart, to admit to me that all this time you were that.
Right.
And now if you're bullied into it, you might say yes because you want to stay in the relationship. Or the alternative is acknowledging, wow, because going back to the systems diagram, because I experienced this from you, this is how I treated you. And then allow kind of a deeper knowing of how this interaction unfolds between these two parties.
Let me tell you how this plays into organizations for a second, which I hadn't been able to see it before looking at this 2x2 with trust and respect on these two axes. In a previous podcast, I was talking to a political scientist, Bill Hurst, and I spoke about hiding things from leadership. And the things I hid were things that I thought were good for the company that they weren't asking from me. And so I was hiding resources so that I could do the things that were good for the company. And it wasn't their fault. It was just that they couldn't see the details of my world because they were distant. But it's very much down in that aversion kind of behavior because I didn't trust them to accurately understand what needed to be done in my organization. And I didn't respect them enough to tell them because I didn't think they could hear it. Because again, the level of detail that was necessary to understand what was happening locally to my organization, it wasn't worth it to try to get that across so that I could do this stuff in the open. Well, that's an unhealthy relationship.
Yeah, and that's culture, right? We could go back to and say all of the things we're discussing live within a bigger culture. So if a culture doesn't allow or doesn't sort of support a person like you to bring forward what it is that you are feeling, then obviously they're not getting the most out of you within that organization. I can tell you a funny story for me. When I was in a corporate, I lived in Vienna, Austria for 10 years, and I was director of a computer company there. And there was this moment where the CEO, who I really liked, still a friend today, but I didn't trust his judgment. And nobody trusted his judgment. So I'm with 8 directors, and we all don't trust that he really knows what he's doing. And I shared with people, and I felt like at some point I felt like a hypocrite because I'm like, I like him. He's an honest, decent person. And I'm not really telling him what I'm feeling. And actually, none of us are telling him what we're feeling. And so I sat in the meeting and it was like emotional. I could feel like even sharing it with you, I can feel my sweat glands go back to the moment of sitting in the room with the 8 directors and saying, okay, I just want to tell you, I don't trust you. I just don't trust you. And then I shared why. I didn't make it personal. I made it less personal at least. And then I kind of looked around that room and all those 7 people like, okay, who's going to go next? It was crickets. Oh, crickets. And then the next day, they all came to my desk. You can imagine. Good job. Great. I totally love, it was incredible. It was finally somebody, but nobody stood with me. Nobody made it a moment to transcend, to create another environment, to move past this talking behind other people's backs. And I just decided to leave the next day.
And you trusted this leader enough to tell them that you didn't respect them. And so you decided to leave because that was a place where you could not be in connection.
Yeah, I think at that point, I didn't necessarily know what I was leaving. It was very early in my own personal development journey. And I just knew that if I couldn't be really honest and authentic, then I didn't want to be in those spaces anymore. It was a life decision more than just a business decision at that moment.
And you speak at some length about expectations. And the reason I'm switching over to this at this point in the conversation is that you just mentioned the idea of culture. And I've heard culture described as, and this is, I hate the word, whenever anybody says, you know what, we need to fix the culture around here. I'm like, when I swing the hammer, what do I hit? I don't know where to find the culture to make it different. So the definition I heard that I liked was culture is a shared set of expectations about each other's behaviors. And so let's talk about expectation, which is sort of the next in the stack of fundamentals of connection.
I love expectations. I think that there are incredible opportunities to connect with others, but I don't think that most see it that way. So one sees I have an expectation of another, how they're going to fulfill their job, what we're going to do for dinner, how we're going to interact with one another, whatever they are, right? I usually use everything I describe as broadly. I don't separate business life and personal life. They're one for me. So when we have an expectation, which isn't fulfilled, I use it always as a moment to connect. Because sometimes I'm even unaware that I had that expectation until I see there's an emotion that came up that I wasn't expecting. It's like, wow, where did that come from? And then I'll interact with the person and say, well, listen, this occurred. And actually, I can't say I didn't know or I just didn't, I'm just confused me. So what was really going on there? So help me understand. And in that moment, the expectation is actually a reason to connect deeper as opposed to something to blame another person for because they created a discomfort in me.
And so here's an example of an expectation so that we define what an expectation is. I didn't write down an example of an expectation, but I'm gonna see if I can do one from memory. They tend to sort of come out as absolutes. Grown-ups support themselves.
Yes.
There's a lot built into that. The word grown-up and are expected to support themselves. And anyone who is not supporting themselves, there's strong judgment. And you said expectations don't listen.
Yeah.
In the book, which I really interesting observation, and that blind expectations wreak havoc. So how do you see this manifesting in people's connections?
A good example would be, we can go back to culture a bit, okay? Because if we take culture and say culture is shared expectations, which I love that definition, so I'll run with it. And then we go into a situation where our culture is you show up on time. And if you don't show up on time, it's disrespectful. So now we've created the culture of that there is disrespect when you don't show up for a meeting on time. So now someone's mom just died and now they come in 10 minutes late. And instead of staying connected and saying, hey, you're late. We know that, usually you're always on time. What's going on? To stay in connection, all of a sudden that individual is shamed for not abiding by whatever it is, what that expectation of the group. So those are the moments where an expectation blinds you from seeing what's really in front of you. And I see it happen all the time, of course.
They almost seem like simple, non-contextual rules, but they may be very silent in us.
Oh, they are. I mean, that's why I went through that first book. The first part was that self diagram, the movement going from where one sees the behavior to where that behavior turns into a deep belief within them that's an unexamined belief, but so strong that it becomes an impediment to connecting with others because we've established that belief to be wholeheartedly true. And if that belief is true, then anyone who has a differing belief is now, instead of it having a differing belief, we judge them as less, or we blame them, or we shame them. And that's the unfortunate thing that I see happening all the time, is that we don't see our expectations as opportunities to discover about ourselves. We see them as a means to judge another person.
Yeah, the diagram that you're talking about is the diagram of iceberg, and above the water is the behavior. That's all we can see. And then underneath that is the feelings, and then deeper in the iceberg is the thoughts, and then deepest of all is the beliefs. And that's where some of these expectations live.
Yeah, and so my issue is always, you're allowed to have beliefs, but if they're blind beliefs that you then use to judge others, that's going to wreak havoc in a relationship with people with differing beliefs.
Yeah, you just don't understand why you don't understand each other.
You don't. And if you're not examining it, you can only imagine. Now it only reinforces itself because you'll go to an echo chamber of people who only share your beliefs, and you'll never understand another person's views or opinions or feelings because you're always, in some ways, vilifying them for their beliefs.
I saw this play out in business once. I was working for a job shop. I don't think we use that word anymore. It's just people who are selling consultants. And it turned out that the people we were consulting to thought that we, who worked for them through this consultancy, were being paid more than we were. So in other words, the consultant who was selling our services was widening the gap between what we were being paid with a higher markup to the client, and the client thought we were being paid more. Half of the team thought that was the ultimate betrayal when we found it out. Ultimate betrayal. And betrayal is an interesting word in this context, right? And a few other people on the team said, no, man, that's business. Of course, that's what they're doing. That's the expectation, is that if they can get a few more dollars out of that margin, they're going to do it. That's probably where I would land today. But at the time I was new to business and I wasn't thinking about it. And my relationship was not with the job shop. It was with the person who hired me at the company. So it's funny how that played out, but it was a clash of expectations.
I know of those moments when I was younger in business. I have a friend who basically he's written several books on triggers and how they show up in business. Christopher Akana, he wrote The Alignment Quotient and the book on safety, which is quite nice. But he looks at what he says are the 7 triggers, and one of the triggers is fairness. Some people are really triggered by fairness. And If it's unfair, then all of a sudden I feel like I'm not getting what I'm supposed to be getting. So all these other things won't trigger me, but that if it's not fair, then I'm triggered.
Which is funny. And honestly, just to be totally clear, this was completely fair because we were getting paid what the job place had told us we were going to get paid. Why were we surprised? Somehow we were, and it didn't feel fair.
I'd like to go back to one other thing, if I may, just to share an aside, which is funny. So I told you about the trust and the respect, right? Those chapters were doing really, really well. So well that I decided to do a game. And I created 20 domains of different subjects. And there was a trust question and a respect question. And it was really beautifully laid out. And I said, now I've got to play test it. So I got 10 couples to come together. And it was one by one. I didn't do it as a group. And I created so much mess you cannot imagine. And I didn't expect, let's put it that way, again, back to the expectation. I didn't expect that when people would answer the questions, how do you feel in this domain and how do you feel in that domain, that they would be judging the other person for how they make them feel.
Right.
And I totally lost sight of that because I don't judge another person for how they make me feel. It's how I feel. And now I get a chance to learn about myself. But that's not the way people work. You made me feel this way. You're responsible for that feeling. So now I think I worked through 7 of these sessions and I had to break in at each session in order to interrupt to do a relationship counseling. And I said, okay, I'm scrapping this for the moment because God forbid my intention to be creating connection and all I'm going to create is the joke with all my friends is you've created a game called divorce. You weren't able to quantify what you were feeling, how you were judging your partner, but now you can.
Super important finding, which is that people blame others for how they make them feel.
Yes, that was the finding. Yeah.
You know, during layoffs, if a company makes you feel afraid, if a company makes you feel sad because one of your friends has been laid off, or if a company makes you feel unimportant. Yeah, that's very interesting.
There's chapters on that, and I call that what you're pointing at is giving away one's agency.
Yeah, let's talk about that, especially in a systems kind of discussion. Where the agency is in the system matters a lot. And so what did you mean, and why is that important when you raised it?
I raised it because the one thing, there's an exercise in the book. There's 30 exercises, right? Each of these chapters has an exercise. And one of the exercises was called popcorn thoughts. The interesting thing is from all the podcasts, I'm sure, is that all those thoughts are popping up in one's head. And then we'll attach to a thought. And that thought will take us down a rabbit hole. And we never really realized that we didn't need to attach to that thought. It was just a thought. And there's so many random thoughts in my brain that if I just allowed them to pop up without attaching, I would just be able to stay present with you. The agency is there are things going on that don't feel good. And I can see my brain wanting to attach blame, but I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to let my brain pull me down a place where I'm losing connection. And now I get to do what you mentioned earlier. I get to ask. I get to say, listen, it didn't feel good and I wish it was different. Can you help me understand why it went down that way? I felt that they were doing a good job and then they said something in the meeting and now they're gone a week later. It doesn't leave a very good impression. Like, can you help me understand what went into the decision that this wasn't going to be a relationship that worked anymore? Like, those are the kind of things you can ask when it's not the presumption of guilt.
Yes. I want to skip way ahead in the book to a couple of things. The energy of intention speaks volumes. And what you're talking about is the intention of the speaker. Recently, Kim Scott, who wrote Radical Candor, came on the show. And her point was clear communication with compassion was the fundamental sort of atom of connection for her inside an organization. The clear communication was basically the difference between being a jerk and being not a jerk, which was the intent of what was behind it. It's very aligned.
I really was dealing with the compassion component of this. Because if I say to somebody, how are you? I can say it in several different ways, and each way will elicit a very different response. And so it's funny because people don't really give much thought to the fact that if I say, Dart, how are you? And if I say, hey, Dart, how are you? You're gonna get and especially if there's a context like maybe your mom passed away, your father passed away,
Mm-hmm.
and so that will create a wholly different experience. And if one isn't conscious of that and tension in that, they'll totally miss the opportunity to connect.
Can I go back to a question way back in trust, way back in the foundation of trust that just sparked for me? How much is trust about someone being consistent versus someone being good? And so if I am reliably a jerk or reliably self-interested, but I'm predictable, can that establish trust? Or do I have to be reliably good?
Remember, trust and respect, again, the two graphs, it's all a personal experience. So for an individual, they would certainly say, hey, I trust him. He's always a jerk. And I trust him because I know that's how he is. So I just trust it. For another person, they wouldn't be able to be around that person and then they'd have no trust. And getting to another point you're making is that, and this is often hard, someone could be good and then have one bad moment, one single moment where they rage. And that single moment will be the one thing that the other person does so that they don't ever have to share anything with them again. You could do 10 years and then one moment, and then people will think, oh, it was a single moment. They'll want to discount it. It's almost like it's hard to accept that you may have just screwed up a relationship. So the only way often to go back to it is either party, right? Neither one has to do it. That either party can do it, but the mea culpa, but like not the I'm sorry mea culpa, not the hey, I'm really sorry, Dart, that really was bad. I don't like how I showed up. That's like the one level. And then the next level is like, Dart, I'm sorry. And maybe even a little bit more like there are issues with my dad that came up. And when I feel that, like I see this really part of myself that I've never felt totally at peace with. And I just want to say I'm really sorry for it. And that gets you potentially, you never know, but it gets you the best potential back to trust. And they may not meet you there. And I always say you do it because it's the right thing to do, not because it's easy, not because you expect an outcome, not because you're doing it with an intention to get it back to where it was. Like, no, this is just the right thing to do. And that becomes more of a life of what I would like to see as sort of an integrity, like a life of I won't, like we started this and you said, what's the hardest thing for me is when the connection, if I lose that moment, I lost the moment to connect.
I have a few closing questions I ask everybody. The first one is, what job do you hire your job to do for you?
The same thing I do for everyone else, actually. Just be there and just really unconditional love and be there. Not show up, but be there in unconditional love.
What does it cost you?
It costs you 2 or 3 times a year the pain of not being met or maybe being misinterpreted.
And that pain is because you've exposed yourself emotionally by being all there. And a few times a year, that exposure is punished, essentially.
And my wife will say to me each time, why do you do this to yourself? Why do you do this to yourself? Why do you do? And I'll say to her, because I lived 30 years pushing those feelings down because I didn't want to have this feeling. And those 30 years weren't worth it. The one thing we didn't talk about, which was something interesting, was that, my mom was killed by a drunk driver when I was 18. And that threw my life in a tailspin. I left the US. I didn't live in the US for 30 years. And I was always running away from the pain. And at 30 years, that was when I wrote my first book. And when I wrote that book, I said, I will not move away from that pain the rest of my life. So I got in the car started on the West Coast, and I drove for 3 months from the West Coast to the East Coast. And I arbitrarily said, I will do 60 sessions. And I'm going to sit and ask people to write a letter to a loved one as if it's the last letter they're ever going to write that person. And I did that because I wrote a letter to my mom because I happened to be taking a sociology of death class in college. And I dawned on me I was going to lose everything I was going to ever love. So I wrote her a letter, and she got that hours before she was killed by a drunk driver.
Mm.
And I realized it was 30 years. And I said, I'm not going to move away from that pain ever again. And it was 30 years of pretending that, so if I push the pain away, I push the joy away, I push the connection, the opportunity to feel really deep emotional being with another, which you can only feel when you let all of that go just to be with them. After 60 sessions where I cried in each of those sessions, because I was like, I can't, like I could feel the urge to shut down and to tell the story without the emotion, because it was so easy. I'd done it for 30 years. I'm like, no more, I'm not doing it. And that's that, call it the unwavering staying, allowing myself to feel, and not trying to keep social graces okay, and not trying to say the CEO might not respect me if I do this. Like, that was no longer allowed in my system. So that was the journey that brought me to, of course, then writing this book, which obviously was the accumulation of all of that perseverance with, now it's time to put this down.
Where can people learn more about you and your work?
The andychaleff.com website is quite fun. If anything, it's just a joy to say, wow, somebody really is putting themselves in the world authentically. It's hand drawn. It spits spats of everything that I'm doing. I do a daily, it was a daily podcast I mentioned to earlier that turned just in COVID time. I did 270 episodes just during COVID. Every day, I just found a topic, and always very random, always very emotional. I cheated on my boyfriend, or just some topic that touched the essence of being human in a very honest and profound way.
So people know, that's Andy Chaleff, Chaleff, 2 F's on andychaleff.com. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.